David Morgan,
And I'm Bill Tillman.
and welcome to Everyday Ethics. Today we're going to be continuing our conversation about overarching values that are important in everyday ethics. Last week we chatted briefly about responsibility and mutual accountability. Today we're going to go even beyond that as we begin to look at what I consider a very difficult chapter in Dr. Tillman's book, his chapter on forgiveness. Now, understand, Bill is the kind of writer that you can understand relatively easily. And it wasn't the writing that made this so difficult. And honestly, it wasn't the theological concepts that made this so difficult. It was the fact that he pointed out the importance of forgiveness, and forgiving others and forgiving self is truly hard work.
Yeah.
And I appreciate you doing that, Bill. Uh, Bill, we were talking before we went on the air about my daughter, Mary, and
Uh-huh.
and how she has done some writing for you in your Center for Congregational Ethics work. She and I were talking about this podcast the other morning before, as I was planning it. And I asked Mary, I said, can you tell me, when I was a pastor, did I ever preach on forgiveness? She goes, well, yeah. I said, well, Mary, can you tell me how many times I talked about how one can go about forgiving someone else, the process, how we get from knowing we need to forgive, which seems to be a universal thought among people, and the importance of forgiveness, but how we get from knowing we should to actually being involved in the work of forgiving others.
Mm.
And I told her that's what we're actually going to be doing today as we talk about that a bit. We've talked in the past about the culture in which we live, and I think we've seen it even exemplified in recent days as more and more people seem to be of the mindset that in dealing with others, it's, as we've talked about, a shame, blame game, and or the need for revenge and retaliation. And even glancing at headlines this morning, I've noticed that, we have to get even. We have to avenge ourselves in some way. And I know I've talked about my classes quite a bit in these podcasts, but yesterday we were looking at Psalms as the semester draws to a close, and we were discussing the imprecatory Psalms.
Mm-hmm.
Those Psalms where individuals are voicing concerns to God, complaints to God. And we talked about Psalm 137, the one where it ends with, blessed are those who, bash the children of their enemies.
Yeah.
And we had a conversation about that. And in part of that was, recognizing that the culture in which we live is indeed one where we seek revenge, where we want someone to get even for the wrongs that have been done for us.
Yeah.
And your chapter helps us work through that, moving from that kind of notion of wanting revenge to being willing, able, and knowing how to forgive others.
Okay. Yeah.
And would you like to introduce your chapter to us?
Okay. Yeah, you picked up on the I guess we could say the fourth horseman of acts of anger, shame, blame, revenge, retaliation. That's deep in the history of humanity. And it's what lots of us come up in. And, it's a tough barrier dealing back against those very powerful dynamics with something that's been named forgiveness. It sounds weak. We're led to believe that it's weak, but what you have already announced today we're going to try to work through suggestions of, well, this is a real part of applied theology, Christian ethics, and get out on the table some practical kinds of suggestions. So, there is in general what we're going to be talking about, but you probably have some more specific directions you want to work with.
I'm hoping that we're able to move from, the fact that we know we need to forgive. We're commanded to. The Bible says forgive.
Yeah, it's an imperative.
Yeah, it is, which reminds me of the ethical theories and the triangle that we used earlier in these podcasts, where on one of the sides we had the rules, the deontology, the obligations of forgiveness.
Mm-hmm.
But I think one of the other areas of forgiveness that I think is crucial, it reflects one of those other sides, and that's the side of teleology or goals.
Right.
I mean, what we want our society to look like.
Yeah, and the consequences of life choices. And I think we can bring that idea in here. What are the effects of forgiveness, acts of forgiveness in social groups, but with regard to ourselves? That I think this idea of forgiveness, we keep the New Testament ideas in mind. The great commandments that Jesus offered: love God, but love your neighbor as yourself. There is some of the sticking point. How do we love? But this idea of forgiveness, there is a strong relationship to what love is. And that begins to move back to, you brought up that first triad, the ethical theories related to relational dynamics. So these other ideas are all part and parcel and move together. But the real proof of the pudding, so to speak, will be how does this play out in regard to how we work with others, but also how is that affecting us? And that I think you have some ideas about how this shame, blame, retaliation, revenge, the effects of those dynamics are not good. So that physical health and mental health. Now, I'm going to hand back to you to elaborate on that idea, because the self-forgiveness begins to be a template for how do we forgive others, and how do we accept the forgiveness of others into ourselves. But if you would pick that up, that would be interesting.
Yeah, I do some things to say about that, none of which really make me feel comfortable. Forgiveness is, I have struggled with being able to forgive perhaps my entire life. And I don't think I'm the only one. All right, I'll admit that it seems to be a somewhat universal trait.
It is, yeah.
But I have even noticed in the past, there have been times that I have felt overwhelmed, stressed, have found myself at my doctor's office. And after several months, no one ever directly said what my issue was, but he couldn't find anything. And it dawned on me it might have something to do with stress, dealing with issues in my life at a particular time in which uh, there was a pent up anger
Yeah,
and hostility.
yeah,
And even today, am still working through the process of forgiving folks in the past, and which has been helpful for me, my own personal health as well as spiritual
right,
and physical health.
right.
It seems a bit odd to me to talk about forgiveness in the sense of forgiving others is going to help me. Almost makes me feel selfish in doing that. And I mean,
Yeah,
obviously it's not one of the best motivations, but certainly it is. We do have to take care of ourselves. And I think the importance of
yeah,
forgiving may benefit us as much as it does others, as you alluded to. Uh, but again, as you know, no, but I was never taught. I mean,
right.
when
Yeah,
I was a pastor, I modeled what I had been taught and been shown by other pastors. And
right.
yep, you ought to forgive. It's important.
Yeah,
But just how do we get there? And I
yeah,
know in your book you made some suggestions for that. You use several different examples. We'll talk about some of those, and we'll mention some of the others in our show notes, continuing the conversation that'll be published along with this. But do you want to get into some of those processes and what you learned and shared in your book?
yeah. And these ideas are a continuation of, well, the idea was, as you mentioned, the book, and even back when I was doing classroom work, um, trying to avoid sounding like some know-it-all academician. Always had all the answers. Um, I'll never forget the lesson I learned from the dedication page of one of Wayne Oates' books,
Hmm.
that he dedicated the book to my students who have been some of my best teachers. And that's just, well, really revelatory. One, about the personality of Wayne Oates, but also when you begin to realize about lessons we learn from the culture, the better teachers that I've known, they are those who are able to have dialogue, conversation with the students. And the same, application with congregational matters. One of the things I see, two trends in our culture now with regard to congregations. There is still a move, and it may be growing, in this authoritarian style of leadership, pastoral
Mhm.
leadership. And one way to identify that, if you're wondering what is authoritarian leadership, is it operate with this shame, blame, retaliation, revenge approach. And some of these people, they just plainly are bullies. That's that's the case. The other trend I see, and you mentioned it there, with the idea of stress effects. Um, there seems to be a growing edge uh, to the idea of self-care. And some of that is diminished by the authoritarian types, that's another expression of weakness, so forth. But if you talk to therapists, psychologists, um, they they're talking about mechanisms that move parallel with these ideas that come right off the pages of the New Testament. But to be more specific, there are a couple of references that I made in this chapter in the book. One, toward the end of the chapter, was to bring in Lewis Smedes, who's now deceased, taught for a number of years at Fuller Seminary in California. but his book called Forgive and Forget. And it began to approach this idea of process, which I think is important to understand about how do we learn how to forgive. And he built off that conversation between the disciple Peter and Jesus, and Peter making reference, how often are we supposed to forgive people? Is it 7 times 7? And sometimes that can legitimately be translated as 70 times 7. But basically, Jesus' response was, you keep on forgiving until you sense you have it done. So, and Smedes translated that on to say, you keep on forgiving for whatever the incident was, the bullying, the things that happened, until you can wish the other person well. And it fits very closely to this idea of shalom that we talked about in the last episode. But that's one reference. Another is Desmond Tutu, also deceased now, but he did a book with his daughter called The Book of Forgiving. And one of the most poignant parts in that book was he borrowed a couple of the stages of grief from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's work, particularly the idea of denial, denying grief from Kubler-Ross. But that dynamic that people use, denying, well, there was any wrong. I'm wrong in feeling like I am hurt about it. And so it's just pushed away. But now, with medical doctors, psychologists, therapists, as you related your story, David, recognize that this kind of denial is built up stress, and it has effect on us. The other stage that Tutu borrowed from Kubler-Ross is that of anger. So someone close to us, we lose them, they die. Or there are other kinds of losses, but our response, it often is an emotional one and starts fitting in with the shame, blame, retaliation, revenge folks. I'm angry about this, so I'm going to make somebody else hurt. I'm angry about this. I shouldn't be, but I am. So who do I take this out? So there it goes. Now, Tutu goes on and has some other steps, but essentially uses those Kubler-Ross stages as identification points, which if we have time, I'll transition now what more specifically I developed in the book chapter. And it's around those ideas that we had discussed in an earlier episode. And what I've borrowed principally out of what's called the scientific method and Bloom's taxonomy, which is the pedagogical methodology for educators. But with regard to forgiveness, that we identify the circumstance, just the opposite of denial, but we identify it. And as best we can, the details about it, the effects it's beginning to have on us. One of the ways that this surfaces is these nagging thoughts that keep rising up. And sometimes at the oddest moments, but by association, we're in a whole nother context and we're reminded of some hurt. Um, and possibly that we have implemented, but certainly something that we feel about it. But to identify that, um, the one idea is write that down. And there it is in pencil, ink, or typed out on your laptop. And then move to the idea of describing that in more detail, which I mentioned in the book chapter. Here is the idea of describing this circumstance, this idea of hurt, what do we do about it, but describing it to someone else. And that idea lies at the heart of this historic idea of confession. It may be in these that I am the confessor, that I hear another person's plea about here's what I'm going through inside. And I need to forgive the other person. Or it may be that you are the confessing one. And that means you've got a trusted person, a sibling, other relative, your partner, your spouse, close friend, that they hear. And it's just an interesting bit of human energy that when we articulate these things, it has a sense of distilling, softening the impact. It's almost like we've literally moved something outside us. But the description can move on to a pattern of, let's analyze this a little more deeply, which would include the other parties, those people who have done injury to us. Now, with shame, blame, retaliation, revenge dynamics weighing on us, this is kind of like 4-on-1, forgiveness being the one. That begins hard. But the point I'm trying to make is we try to perceive the humanity about the other person. Back to the concept that we've raised before, the image of God. Everyone will maintain is made in the image of God. There is something of the light, the personality, the character of God in every other human being. Certainly it's harder to see in some people than others. But even the point, why is it that this person acts this way? And in my experience, more often than not, the bullies have been bullied. The shame, blame, all of that, if you can get into it close enough, those people have come up in a culture in which it's basically a cycle of violence.
Mm-hmm.
And violence has different expressions. It might be physical, emotional, verbal. But if you can pick up those descriptions of the other people, trying to understand them as other people, that's part of this analysis. And it's taking some investigation, which moves to the idea, how do we interpret that? And I want to be quick to include here the idea, we just move around in a context that needs forgiveness, and we are in relationship with people there are different stages at work here of this identification, description, analysis, depending upon all of the circumstances, which complicates all of this, and the temptation to go back to denial is very real. But to try to interpret all of that, and for us, we're developing this podcast in the context of Christian ethics education, driven by the values, dynamics, the examples, particularly in the New Testament, Christian scriptures. So that's part of the interpretation. You said there early on the idea of forgiveness, that's a command off the pages of the New Testament. And so how do we respond to commands? But here's the accountability. We call ourselves Christians. We are accountable for those kinds of commands. So that's part of the interpretation. But to go on, applying what we're beginning to understand and articulate to someone else, the one who has done us wrong. Well, one of the examples I used to put in front of students years ago was that perhaps the most difficult thing that they were going to have to do, because they will be ministers out of who they are. And if there is a spirit and attitude of non-forgiveness in there, that's how they're going to be ministers. And particularly with regard, what is their relationship with their parents? And for many people, I had graduate level students, so they are in their mid-20s and older. It wasn't unusual at all. They had already lost one or both parents. And they still had details, ideas, incidences that had happened. It made it very difficult for them to think well about their parents. So my suggestion was, here is the lesson. Can you, even toward those who are deceased, begin to implement these ideas about forgiveness? Now, Smead's book, Forgive and Forget, he made the strong point, we truly can't forget.
Right.
But can we redeem the memories? And there is the implementation of forgiveness. It is a redemption act, which just becomes a multi-volume about living the Christian life. Well, I went a long time there, David.
Well,
so I'm shifting time back to you.
I appreciate you going a long time, because I think I and others need to recognize that this is a process. It's not a one and done type of event.
Good thought. Yeah.
I mean, I can say that I forgive someone,
Wow.
and something tomorrow triggers me, and I'm back in that same cycle with the same person and the same event.
Right.
And so this has been very helpful for me in dealing with that, and I want to thank you for that. And we will post information on your book so that others can see more details about what you have said, and how they can help follow the process as well. One of the things yesterday, as we were talking about the imprecatory Psalms and forgiveness in my class, that I found helpful from even listening and reading what you had to say was I could tell the students, okay, I don't feel comfortable with passages in the Bible talking about bashing children,
Right.
killing infants. And I struggle with
Right.
that. And then the
Right.
question is, why is it here? And one
Yeah.
of the things I shared with them was Psalm speaks to all of our emotional experiences,
Right.
and we can identify with the psalmist.
Yeah.
And maybe at the very least, as we begin this process of forgiveness, we can forgive ourselves for the kind of thoughts that keep us from forgiving. We don't have to feel guilty, I don't think,
Right. Right.
because we're still working through the process of forgiveness.
Right.
And I was able to stress that to students that, okay, it's going to take a while for this to happen. But as
Oh,
you're working through this process, uh, you're going to be, building relationships with others, or at least possibly building a relationship with
right.
others.
Right.
You've not written it
Right.
off forever.
Right.
And I think you talked about we want to go to reach the point where we can bless someone else.
Yeah, that's Smead's idea,
Right,
but it was Jesus' idea.
right. It is at
Well,
that.
the Psalms that you talked about, um, there's a huge amount of these kinds of Psalms.
Mhm.
That section of the Old Testament, they're under the major category of lament, which 137, it is lament. We were in captivity,
Right.
the world had turned upside down. And it's poetic narrative, but at the same time, like poetry can, it struck all the chords of just how horrible that was for these people.
Mhm.
We might be in even a worse emotional state.
Mm.
Most of those Psalms of Lament, they had a dynamic about them that they would begin. I mean, look at Psalm 69, Psalm 83.
Mm.
And here are the examples that they start in a pretty high worship adoration stage toward
Mhm.
God. And then the psalmist, the composer, begins to name the enemies of the nation, of the composer personally, names them, and then names what should be done to those
Right.
people in stark, barbaric terms. And it's almost like all of that has gotten out, and the tone begins to turn and move back up, and all of this energy is given back to God.
Right.
And the not so subtle message is, here's what I would like to do and what I would like for you to do, but I'm going to leave it to you, God, of what happens to these people.
Right.
For now, I have vented. There is a catharsis I've experienced. There is the beginning of I'm wishing them well.
And that beginning is where we pick up when we
That's
move
where
on. And okay, back to the hard work idea. It's not going to be easy for us to do so, but
no,
it's,
no,
we've talked about Christian life, Christian disciplines, etc.
yeah,
We have to discipline ourselves to exercise, to learn how to do it better. We continue to exercise these steps, pathways that you have suggested for us as we move towards forgiveness. And it takes, time, effort, determination, persistence.
Yeah.
All are values we could talk about at another time. But I think next week we will be talking specifically about courage. And
all of this takes courage.
forgiving people in a world of revenge and retaliation
Right.
is a very courageous act, because, for your own personal safety and health, it could turn back on you.
Sure.
Sure could. So we are going to talk about that next week. I thank you today for working with us through this process. It has been most helpful to me.
Oh, well, thank you.
And again to others. And for those of you who are listening to this podcast, we thank you for listening today. We appreciate the confidence that you have in us. And until we chat again, let us go about doing good. Let us walk as Jesus walked.
Everyday Ethics is brought to you by the T.B. Maston Foundation, which seeks to proclaim the abiding relevance of the whole gospel of Jesus Christ and provide support for the study and application of Christian ethics. For more information or to donate, visit tbmaston.org.